Kyōraku Shunsui's Katen Kyokotsu is one of my favourite zanpakutō in Bleach. Its Shikai has the incredibly unique ability to turn children's games into reality, and it's one of the clearest demonstrations of Kubo's immense creativity and talent, while at the same time also being one of the series' most fiendishly powerful and tricky to deal with weapons, ensnaring both Kyōraku and his opponent in an inescapable game, wherein they must play by the rules in order to survive. And even then, these games are often played to the death. Through the use of his extraordinary Shikai, Kyōraku has battled and overcome some of the series' most powerful characters, displaying his ability to take charge of a situation and totally overwhelm his opponent, often blending games together or using them in quick succession to disorient and then defeat his foes. In the manga, Kyōraku uses a total of 6 different games across his various battles, each with completely different effects, triggers, and outcomes, making Katen Kyokotsu one of, if not the single, most versatile Shikai in all of Bleach. You can imagine that if a children's game exists, then it's likely Katen Kyokotsu can turn it into an ability if it hasn't done already. And actually that makes me wonder how Katen Kyokotsu comes across new abilities. Does Kyōraku have to know of the game beforehand and teach it to Katen Kyokotsu, or does the sword somehow inherently already know these different games and how to then utilize them in battle? I'd love to know. But anyway, I decided to make this video now specifically because we've spent a bit of time lately discussing Kyōraku Shikai. The most recent Bleach versus battle on the channel saw Kyōraku going up against Kisuke Urahara, and in that video, we talked a lot about Kyōraku's various different games, and dove deep into Kage Oni and how it works during one of our most recent Club Outside Q&A roundups. So I figured now was a good time to bring all of the Shikai games under one umbrella and discuss them all right here. So, without further ado, these are Katen Kyokotsu's various games in the order in which they appear throughout the manga, and we are only going to be looking at the zanpakutō's manga abilities today, though Kyōraku has utilised other games in both the supplementary light novels and mobile games too. Make sure to let me know which is your favourite down below, and what other games you imagine would make for a strong ability. Of course, remember guys to hit subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. It does help the channel massively. We're trying to reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year, and it's only going to be possible with your help. So if you liked what you saw, if you're new here, or if you haven't hit subscribe yet, consider doing so today. And also check out my Patreon as well, where you can take your support for this channel another step further, and you can support me for as little as $1 a month. It does go a long way. I really would appreciate it. So if you like the channel, consider checking out the Patreon as well. So first up we have Bushōgoma, which Kyōraku uses in chapter 362. Bushōgoma represents a spinning top, and when Kyōraku uses this ability, he himself twists around, holding his dual blades outstretched. As he does, Katen Kyokotsu conjures a rapid whirlwind that is then flung towards the enemy. Once trapped within the gale, the energy whips around Kyōraku's target like a tornado, essentially containing them within. The whirlwind is manifested at such a speed that even Stark was momentarily caught off guard by its sudden appearance. There are a few things I want to say about Bushōgoma before we move on. This is the very first of Katen Kyokotsu's abilities that we ever saw, and as a result, I actually think its appearance is maybe something of a meta joke on Kubo's part. What I mean by that is, before the true ability of Kyōraku Shikai was known to us, everyone speculated that Katen Kyokotsu was going to be a wind-based zanpakutō, to the point where games like the Blade of Fate on DS actively gave Kyōraku wind-based abilities. And so, when Bushōgoma was first used, giving us our first insight into Katen Kyokotsu's powers, and it took the form of a gale force tornado, everyone collectively was like, yep, wind-based powers as expected. Except, Kyōraku would then go on, without explanation, to later use Taka Oni, which was like, okay, that's kind of weird, but sure, and then later Kage Oni, at which point it was like, okay, that's pretty strange, maybe this isn't a wind zanpakutō after all, and then finally, the truth was revealed. So I can't help but wonder if Kubo went into this reveal knowing that. I mean, he obviously would have known what the general consensus was surrounding Katen Kyōkotsu's at the time unrevealed ability, to the point of the official games themselves representing it as such. I think the Blade of Fate also gave Ukitake water and lightning abilities for his Shikai Sogyo no Kotowari, which actually may have been cooler than what we ended up getting, but I think essentially they were just giving those characters abilities based on the names of their zanpakutō of the zanpakutō release command, and obviously ended up not being right at all. So a part of me likes to believe that he chose Bushōgoma to be the first ability to purposefully trick everyone into thinking that they were right about Katen Kyōkotsu being wind-based all along. But maybe that's just me being a conspiracy theorist. Another thing about Bushōgoma that's interesting, though, is that despite being the first ability we ever see from this zanpakutō, it's also one of the few that, these days, just isn't really detailed at all. And by that I mean, what are the rules for this thing? Does it even have any? Is there anything the other player can do to try and win in this situation? In that sense, Bushōgoma seems to be one of the more straightforward and even offensive of Katen Kyōkotsu's abilities. I think there are spinning top games where each player has to try and keep theirs spinning for as long as possible, but that doesn't really seem to be factored in here at all. Speaking of it being used offensively, however, Bushōgoma is used by Kyōraku to destroy Stark's wolves in the anime, which I always thought was really weird and didn't really make any sense whatsoever. I mean, we've already seen by this point in the story that the wolves can reconstitute themselves after being struck by attacks like Rose's Kinshara, for example, but apparently, because Bushōgoma is kind of wind-based, at least on the surface, it blew the wolves away, or something like that, even though it was also explained already that the wolves aren't Sero or flames or even anything really truly tangible, but literal pieces of Stark's soul. Very strange. I get the feeling that depiction of Bushōgoma isn't really indicative of how it works at all, but anyway, that's the first of Kyōraku's games that we get to see. The second of Katen Kyōkotsu's games arrives in that very same chapter, chapter 362. Taka Oni is perhaps the game that we know the absolute least about, and it certainly feels the most mysterious of the bunch. With Stark ensnared by Bushōgoma, Kyōraku leaps high into the air above the espada, lifting his two swords into a cross formation. I have no idea if the cross formation has anything explicitly to do with Taka Oni, but he does it. Here, Kyōraku tries to activate Taka Oni, but is cut off when Stark shoots a Sero into the sky at the captain, causing him to instead reappear beside the espada instead, the game having apparently been cancelled. Or was it? You see, much later in chapter 374, Kyōraku gives us a brief explanation as to how Taka Oni works, simply telling Stark that with Taka Oni, whoever goes the highest wins. And that makes me wonder, did Stark actually win Taka Oni by firing a Sero into the air? Did the Sero beam technically count as going higher than Kyōraku in that moment? Or was the game simply cancelled by Kyōraku having to get out of the way? If that's the case, what does winning Taka Oni actually look like from Stark's perspective in particular? Like I said, this is definitely the game about which we know the very least, which is then followed up by the game about which we know the most, Kage Oni. Kage Oni is technically first revealed in chapter 373, as the chapter ends with Stark making contact with his own shadow on the ground, only to be suddenly stabbed through the back. However, the technique isn't revealed and explained in full until the following chapter, chapter 374. Retracting his blade, Kyōraku emerges from Stark's shadow, and reveals that Kage Oni is a game which involves trying to step on your opponent's shadow. Whoever has their shadow stepped on loses. In actuality, the ability seems to allow the players to manipulate shadows entirely, with Kage Oni turning shadows into actual pocket dimensions for Kyōraku to hide in. Kage Oni is a little weird, in that we never actually see one of Kyōraku's enemies exploit the game itself for their own advantage. And in that sense, it absolutely feels like Katen Kyokotsu's most straightforward offensive power. What I mean by that is, going off the rules of the game as we know and understand them, presumably Stark or Liege could have entered Kyōraku's shadow in the same way he does, in the same way he enters their shadow, and it would have become a pocket dimension for them to use as well, but no one ever does it. That's not to say others don't exploit the shadows in some way. In chapter 645, Liege correctly guesses where Kyōraku will exit the shadows from early in their fight, and fires the X-axis into the shadow itself, clipping Kyōraku's foot as he tries to avoid it. Later in chapter 651, Liege forces Nanao to eject from a small shadow on his beak as he conjures a ball of light to rid the battlefield of shadows entirely. So we do see the Stern Ritter in particular taking advantage of the shadows in some way, using them against Kyōraku, but none of Kyōraku's opponents ever actually steps on his shadow, unless Liege shooting into the shadow is supposed to count as the same thing, but well, I mean, I guess it could do. On that same vein, I feel like Kage Oni is used somewhat liberally by Kubo, and what I mean by this is, back in chapter 374, once Kyōraku is already outside of Stark's shadow again, he simply plunges his blade into the ground itself, after which a shadow blade bursts out of the Espada's shadow and tries to strike him. But at least to me, in this moment, it doesn't seem like Kyōraku has moved at all, or managed to step on Stark's shadow again, nor is he even stabbing Stark's shadow in this moment, so it's a bit odd. Although, having said that, slightly earlier in this same chapter we can see on this particular panel that Kyōraku is, in fact, still standing on Stark's shadow, so I guess that means that he can just continually stab someone's shadow for as long as he stands on it, and Kage Oni will continue to work. That seems pretty crazy to me, to be honest. Meanwhile, in the battle against Liege, the usage of Kage Oni is expanded upon greatly, and we get to see that it does actually create a fully realised pocket dimension, through which the shadows of the players act as literal doorways to enter. Presumably, Kyōraku can't enter or exit this world via any shadow. It would have to be the shadows of the combatants playing the game. You know, he himself tells Stark that anyone caught within the vicinity of Katen Kyokotsu's spiritual pressure is a player, which makes sense to me. And also it's cool because he can hide multiple people within this shadow world as well. Like I said, Kage Oni definitely feels like the game that we have spent the most time with, that's had the most exposure, with Kyōraku even using it to stab what he thought was Aizen through the back in chapter 391 as well. Next up, we have maybe the most abstract of Katen Kyokotsu's abilities, Iro Oni. Also revealed in chapter 374, Iro Oni is a colour-based game, and one with devastating consequences for the loser. Based on what we've seen, Iro Oni feels to me the most like a traditional game being played out between the two combatants, one where each player can take control of the game by manipulating and getting the most out of its rules, out of its clear risk versus reward system. The game seems to be initiated simply by Kyōraku calling out Iro Oni and then selecting a colour. So I mean, feasibly I feel like he could win on turn 1 if he called out the most dangerous colour as he knows it and understands it for both players, as presumably he always gets to go first. And in this instance, we can see him actually toying with Stark by choosing a colour that won't hurt the Espada too much, cluing him into how Iro Oni works to actually give him a chance. Essentially, each fighter takes turns in calling out a colour. Once the colour is called, that's the only colour they'll physically be able to cut on that turn. The key here is that the same is true for the opponent as well, and the more there is of the chosen colour present between the two combatants, the more damage cuts to that colour will do. So, to explain it based on what we see in the manga, Kyōraku goes easy on Stark initially calling out the colour grey on his first turn. Stark is the only character between the two of them to have any grey on him, and it's a pretty small amount as well. This means Kyōraku literally cannot be hurt this turn as he has no grey on him. But, as it's the safest colour, Kyōraku could have chosen for himself the lowest risk possible. It does virtually no damage to Stark either, despite feeling like a normal strike. Meanwhile, on Stark's turn, the Espada goes big right away and chooses white. Both he and Kyōraku have a lot of white on them, so it's a dangerous colour for Stark to play. Because if Kyōraku had managed to attack him successfully instead, Stark would have been heavily injured. However, Stark succeeds in cutting Kyōraku's Hayori and deals a massive amount of damage as a result. But the battle ends with Kyōraku making a daring gambit. The captain casts aside his Hayori completely, leaving only his Shahakusho, which is completely black. Therefore, this is the single most deadly colour Kyōraku could choose for himself, and Stark also has a lot of black on him as well. In calling out black, Kyōraku is able to kill Stark outright after securing a direct hit, and it's safe to assume that if Stark hadn't been caught off guard, and if he had managed to land a strike instead anywhere on Kyōraku's now very exposed and vulnerable self, he would have won the fight instead. But as Kyōraku is the one who lands the successful hit, he wins both the game and the fight. I have always found this to be a little dubious though. It's pretty clear the target that Kyōraku goes for is Stark's hollow hole on his chest, and by successfully cutting it with such a huge swing, Kyōraku literally ruptures Stark's body. He breaks the Espada in two. But if we're being pedantic here, is the hollow hole really black? Obviously it is in the manga, because Stark's coat causes it to look black, but really there's actually nothing there at all, so that's a bit suspect. You could argue it's more the absence of any colour whatsoever, but it's still a cool moment altogether, and presumably means Iro Oni can affect things simply based on the colour they appear to be in the moment. Though even then I have a hard time believing the hollow hole would be absolutely pitch black, but there you go. Moving on, we now have the two new games to be introduced in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. First up is Daruma-san ga Koronda, which is revealed in chapter 644. Daruma-san ga Koronda is itself a real-life children's game known throughout the world by a variety of other names, including Statues, Grandma's Footsteps here in the UK among others, and perhaps most famously, Red Light, Green Light. Lige himself notes that he knows the game by the name Chocolate Ingles. In this game, upon activation, Kyōraku designates his attacker as It, after which he then tries to move to their location without being spotted. If successful, Kyōraku seems to be pretty much guaranteed to land a surprise attack. In the manga, Lige only survives because he is incredibly fast, but the captain still manages to cut the Sternritter's sniper rifle in half. As with all of these games, Kyōraku is clearly at an inherent advantage as he gets to make the first move and initiate the game. In chapter 645, Lige actually explains the game as he knows the rules himself, revealing that Kyōraku needs to be able to at least see the Reiatsu released via his enemy's attack in order to initiate the game. In the previous chapter, Lige was sniping the Gotei 13 from afar, while they had no idea where he was. However, Kyōraku instigates Daruma-san ga Koronda in order to discover Lige's whereabouts, using the game to see the Sternritter's power in the distance. From there, the game is underway, and it allows Kyōraku to move along the shortest possible trajectory to reach his opponent without being seen. It seems the only way the person who is now It knows the game is afoot is because Kyōraku has to call out Daruma-san ga Koronda, and they seem to be able to hear it no matter where they are in proximity to him. Now, while to Lige's eyes he effectively teleports behind him because Lige loses the game, that's not what's happening, and had Lige spotted Kyōraku making his way towards him, he could have won. However, Kyōraku ensures that this can't happen by successfully tricking Lige with a decoy, solidifying a perfect image of himself using just his Reryoku, his spirit energy, which Lige believes to be the real captain, and so has no reason to look elsewhere. That's also a pretty insane thing to be able to do, to be honest, especially as Kyōraku says, considering Lige's own power and skill, he should reasonably be able to detect virtually anything that's amiss. For the Sternritter to have literally no idea he was looking at a fake is mightily impressive. It's a mini Kyokotsu essentially, formed just by Kyōraku's own immeasurable control over his spiritual energy. And it's by combining that with Daruma-san ga Koronda that Kyōraku wins the game. At this point, Kyōraku begins actively combining games to try and overwhelm Lige. As soon as their duel begins for real, Kyōraku tries to use Daruma-san ga Koronda again, this time up close, by once again leaving an afterimage of himself behind, though this one is so sophisticated that it actually moves. However, Lige doesn't fall for it this time and turns on the spot, believing he's caught sight of the real Kyōraku and thus won the game. The Sternritter shoots the captain, but it's again a fake. The real Kyōraku is busy actually playing Kage Oni, and has successfully stepped on Lige's shadow. As a true testament to Lige's skill, however, the Sternritter still manages to not only dodge this, but also turn the tables and shoot the real Kyōraku as he exits the shadow at the same time. It's a great sequence. But all of this leads into the final game revealed in the manga, Kageokuri. Based on a game where children stare at their own shadow for several seconds before looking away, after which they can see an afterimage of their shadow in front of them. To put it very simply, Kageokuri allows Kyōraku to create shadow clones of himself, which then trick the opponent in the midst of battle. This is essentially what Kyōraku did when tricking Lige earlier in the fight, but in both chapters 645 and 646, he actually fully explains what's going on, revealing that his opponent must keep their eyes on the real Kyōraku at all times. If they look away from the real Kyōraku and are tricked by one of his shadow clones, then any Kyōraku they see from that point on could in fact be a shadow clone. Is this maybe the craziest of all of Katen Kyokotsu's games? I think it might be, because it honestly feels almost impossible for the opponent to keep up. In the manga, the real Kyōraku at last appears in front of Lige, and manages to cut what's left of his rifle in half yet again, causing Lige to momentarily look down at the ground as his weapon breaks in two. In this moment, Lige is ensnared by Kageokuri once again, and the real Kyōraku is able to appear right behind him, almost killing the Sternritter with a massive swing. And after this, we basically see how Kageokuri can completely overtake and consume an enemy, with nowhere left to look, and no idea what's real and what isn't. Lige finds himself being chased and hunted down by countless shadow clones. As far as he's concerned, any of them could be the real Kyōraku, all of them bringing their blades down upon him. Of course, the real Kyōraku is in fact among them, and he plunges his sword through the Sternritter's back, seemingly ending the fight. Honestly, the way the shadow clones amass themselves as Lige basically runs scared at that point is very cool to see. It's a brief glimpse at how one mistake by the Sternritter opens him up to being completely overcome by the game and losing it in a big way. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. Those are the 6 games that we get to see of Katen Kyokotsu Shikai in the manga. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Which of the 6 games is your favourite and why? And like I said, what other children's games do you think would make a great ability for Kyōraku Shikai? I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. And let me know your thoughts on the supplementary games we learn of as well in the light novel and the game Bleach Brave Souls. Again, I didn't cover those today, but I'd still love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and took something of value away from it as well. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you liked it and you want to see more just like this. We're trying to hit 300,000 subs by the end of the year. It's only possible with your help. And again, if you want to take that support for the channel another step further, consider supporting me over on Patreon too. I really would appreciate it. Just like every single one of these Patreon supporters is doing, it's making a huge difference and going a very long way. And I want to thank each and every one of you so very much. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.